I have two of your books here. The first one being From Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic, and the second one being The Development of Old English. Now, when we talk about where English comes from, as the title of your first volume suggests, the first thing we have to talk about is where Proto-Germanic comes from. So, when and how does Proto-Germanic sort of distinguish itself from the other branches of Indo-European?
That's complicated, especially the when. Recent work in ancient DNA, there's actually a research letter that appeared within the past year in the journal Nature from David Reich's lab in Harvard. Um, Recent work makes it fairly clear that Proto-Indo-European was spoken somewhere near the Black Sea, can't really tell where, something like 4,000 years before the Common Era, maybe somewhat earlier than that. Um, and there's a long space of time between, say, 4000 BCE and the appearance of Germanic languages in Central Europe, as attested by the Romans, who kept running into them militarily, right? Um, you have to say something about the diversification of Proto-Indo-European. By now, there's general agreement that the Anatolian subfamily, that's the one that includes Hittite, split off from the other languages first, and that the Tocharian subfamily that fetched up in Central Asia, in Xinjiang province along the Silk Road, split off second. And there's decent archaeological evidence that the Tocharians took off around 3,500 before the Common Era. So that's when the two outlying branches of the family have gone away, and the remaining group apparently continues to develop together for a while. Now, what happens next is a little cloudy. It's clear that Italic and Celtic, Italic being the branch that includes Latin, it's clear that Italic and Celtic share a few innovations in inflectional morphology that the other languages do not. And it's clear that Germanic, Balto-Slavic, Indo-Iranian, Greek, and probably Armenian also share a few innovations in inflectional morphology that Italic and Celtic do not. That's important. And this is the first time I'm going to say this, but I think it's going to keep coming up. Um, we know a good deal about native language acquisition by now. We know that the sound system of a language and the inflectional morphology are acquired early, usually by the age of 7, often long before that, and resist modification later in life.
Hmm.
So regular sound changes and inflectional morphology are the best flags, signposts to the descent of a language. This means that, in spite of the fact that it shares a good deal of vocabulary with Italic and Celtic, Germanic is an Eastern language.
Hmm.
That its closest relatives are, in fact, probably the Balto-Slavic languages. So we have to imagine Germanic coming from somewhere down in the Ukraine to somewhere in southern Scandinavia in all those centuries between 3,500 before the Common Era and when? Well, people are fairly certain that Germanic is represented archaeologically by the Jastorf culture, which shows up in southern Denmark and the adjacent part of northern Germany, basically Schleswig and Holstein, um, around 700 before the Common Era. That's almost 3,000 years that we can't look into,
Right.
right? So what happened during that period was presumably many of the things that make Germanic distinctive. But more specific than that, we really can't be. But okay, since we've got a connection with Jastorf culture, let's talk about that. In, say, 700 or 600 before the Common Era, Jastorf culture occupies a fairly small area. So that would be the kind of area that a single dialect or a single group of very closely related dialects could occupy under pre-state conditions. But, and I'm gonna quote from something that I wrote because I don't think I can put it any better than I did back then. This is an article that appeared in 2013 in the Festschrift for Hans Hock, um, called The Linguistic Diversity of Aboriginal Europe. And what I said was the basic fact of pre-state language distribution is that no single language can occupy for more than a few centuries an area too large for all its native speakers to communicate with one another regularly.
Mhm.
Now, the reason for that is simple and straightforward. Innovations in grammar or pronunciation almost certainly start as native learner errors. They catch on the playground or the preschool or the village street. They're reinforced by the errors of other little kids also learning the language. Um, and if they manage to survive until the kids are, let's say, teenagers, then they have a decent chance of becoming long-term linguistic changes. But they start out very, very local and they spread from there. And they can't spread without a lot of contact so that people can copy one another. That's how changes spread, by people copying one another's speech. So as you go forward in time from 700 or 600 before the Common Era, Jastorf culture expands enormously and begins to diversify into subcultures and so forth. And pretty soon it's too big to be the area that a single dialect or even maybe a single language could occupy. Okay, now that's the archaeological situation.
Right.
Working back from the attested languages, can we estimate when Proto-Germanic was spoken? Well, that's hard because just as there is no biological clock according to which DNA evolution occurs, so also there is no lexical clock or morphological clock according to which language innovations occur. Sometimes they come in bunches, sometimes there seems to be stability for several generations. But we do have early runic inscriptions beginning around 200 of the Common Era from southern Denmark, right in the middle of the Astorf area, right? Um, and they are disturbingly not very different from our reconstructed Proto-Germanic. They're not identical, but they're not radically different either. So we have to ask ourselves, how long could the descendant of Proto-Germanic in the center of what had been the Astorf area survive without a great deal of change that would show up in the early runic inscriptions? Now, okay, they're short. They don't tell us everything we want to know, but pushing Proto-Germanic back to 300 before the Common Era, that might be plausible enough. 500 years without a lot of phonological or syntactic change? Maybe. The further back you push it, the less plausible it becomes. It's a matter of estimating the probabilities, and that's difficult to do. But it means we have to be cautious. All those Germanic tribes that the Romans encountered, beginning with the Battle of Noreia in 113 before the Common Era, it's unlikely that the dialects they spoke were all descended from the Proto-Germanic that we can reconstruct from the well-attested languages much later.
Hmm.
Gothic around 350 of the Common Era, and all the others substantially later than that. So our reconstructed Proto-Germanic was probably one dialect of a broader Proto-Germanic.
Right.
Now, we would like to have good records of, let's say, what the Marcomanni and Quadi were speaking down on the Danube when Marcus Aurelius was fighting them right in the second
Right.
century. But we do not. Okay.
Is it not Swahili? That's what they speak in the Gladiator movie. Um,
I think we can be certain it's not Swahili. Um, well, for a movie, you ought to get somebody who actually speaks a language, right? Because to try to teach people to speak reconstructed Proto-Germanic or whatever, oh man, that's hard. You know,
yeah,
they,
for sure.
I guess they could have got him to speak Icelandic, which is fairly, conservative, but what the heck? Um,
Yeah.
anyway, this means that there's a fair amount of uncertainty involved. If I have to guess, I'm going to guess that our reconstructible Proto-Germanic was spoken somewhere around the western end of the Baltic, sometime around 300 before the Common Era, give or take a century, something like that. Now, if you work out the changes that occurred between Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Germanic, some of them are just isolated changes, and you have no idea when they occurred. But occasionally you get long sequences of changes which interacted in such a way that you can put them in a relative chronology. And if you look at the sound changes that lead from Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic, you can get a chain as long as 13 changes,
Hmm.
which has got to mean that the changes at the beginning of a chain like that, a long chain, have got to be comparatively early. How early? Hard to say. But the ones that are not shared with any other branch of Indo-European, yet are early, such as Grimm's law and Werner's law, you could undo all the changes back to those and say, okay, this is an earlier stage of Proto-Germanic, at least approximately.
Hmm.
That's more or less what Wolfram Euler has done in his books. He writes in German. You got to be able to read German to read his stuff. But he's trying to reconstruct an earlier stage of Proto-Germanic, essentially by internal reconstruction and exploiting relative chronologies. Um, since he's doing that, I've stayed out of it. But it is worth doing. And some of his results are fairly interesting.
Hmm. So one question I have then when talking about this, especially since we say things like Balto-Slavic is sort of similar to Proto-Germanic, or at least they might be like some, sort of akin. When we talk about, say, Gothic and then Proto-West Germanic, descending from Proto-Germanic, should we understand that these two groups, say like if we want to equate Gothic and Proto-West Germanic, should we understand that they have come from one language and that
Yes,
is Proto-Germanic? So we should, okay.
yes,
And
that's
then,
what that means.
okay.
That's what it means. To say that two languages are related means that they are descended from a common ancestor.
Hmm.
Now, not necessarily a single dialect, but at least a single identifiable language whose dialects were mutually intelligible with one another, right?
Okay.
So, what it looks like is that we have Proto-Germanic, and that's clearly a single language. We have Proto-Balto-Slavic, um, and that's a little harder to reconstruct because Baltic and Slavic have been diverging for a long, long time. But it was
Hmm.
clearly a single language too. We have Proto-Indo-Iranian, and that was clearly and obviously a single language. And it looks like what we've got is a kind of dialect continuum, with
Hmm.
Germanic on the northwest and maybe Greek at the southeast, somewhere toward the Caucasus. Um, the obvious question is that all there was, or were there other groups in the middle that have died out? We don't know. But either way, it's fairly likely that the ancestors of all these distinct languages did form a dialect continuum very, very early in their diversification, and that they swapped changes, that innovation spread from one group to a neighboring group repeatedly. You can actually show that that happened between Indo-Iranian and Balto-Slavic. It's less obvious between Balto-Slavic and Germanic, but there are a few decent candidates. Um, if we want to say how Proto-Germanic distinguishes itself from, let's say, Balto-Slavic, you could look at the details. You could point out that beyond a certain point, they stop sharing regular sound changes, and each one goes its own way with its own regular sound changes. Um, but it's also useful, I guess, especially if you're approaching this as a student or as a linguist, to ask, what's special about Germanic? Is it just a bunch of details that add up? Um, no, actually. Some of the changes that occurred were, I won't say trivial, but not very far-reaching. You know, you get a sound change that affects 3 words or 5 words. Yeah, it's a distinctive change, but it doesn't change the language much. But you get other sound changes like Grimm's law and Werner's law that completely revamp the system of consonants, right? And that particular group of sound changes, Grimm's law and Werner's law, is what's really most distinctive about Germanic in terms of its sounds. So much so that you can ask for a list of 20 or 24 basic words in a language, if it's Indo-European, and look at it and say immediately whether it belongs to the Germanic subgroup or not.
Right.
Similarly, in the inflectional morphology, what happened among the nouns is in detail, 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 detail. What happened to the verbs was drastic. Okay. Proto-Indo-European had an aspect-based verb system. That
Mhm.
is, the basic stems did not indicate tense. They indicated whether the action had any internal structure or not.
Okay.
The modern Greek verb system is still organized that way, and it's directly descended from the Proto-Indo-European system. Greek, especially ancient Greek, especially Homeric Greek, is a really good indication of what the Proto-Indo-European verb was like.
Mhm.
Germanic has completely overhauled the whole thing, right? They started with a present stem that indicated imperfective aspect, that is, an action with some kind of internal structure, continuous or repeated or distributed or whatever, and an aorist stem, which indicated that something just happened, and a perfect stem, which was a stative, which indicated a state, like know or remember or be holding something up or be in a standing position. When you get to Proto-Germanic, you discover that the aorist stem is gone. It's just gone. The present stem now indicates present time. The perfect stem, which used to be a stative, has split. For a small, archaic group of verbs called preterite presents, the
Mhm.
perfect is the source of the Germanic present tense. For the rest of the verbs, it's the source of the past tense. And because it was not possible to make a perfect from a derived verb in Proto-Indo-European, derived verbs in Proto-Germanic, called weak verbs, have worked out a completely new way of forming the past tense. Now, the details don't matter, though you can read about it in the Germanic book if you like. But the point is that the whole verb system has been completely, totally overhauled. It's
Mhm.
totally different. The pieces all go back to Proto-Germanic. The arrangement of them, the system does not. And again, you can identify a Germanic language by asking for 20 or 24 of the commonest verbs and simply examining how they make their present and past tenses. You'll know it's Germanic in 30 seconds if you
Mhm.
know about Germanic languages. So that's a second thing, which is very distinctive about Germanic. The third thing is this distinction between strong and weak adjectives. That is, most adjectives have two complete paradigms. One, let's simplify this. Let's say for use with a definite article or a possessive, and another for basically everything else.
Mhm.
The distinction, as we find it in, say, Old English, is functionless. It depends entirely on the syntax. Well, it can't have been functionless originally. It must have had a function. Um, a Lithuanian scholar named Artūras Ratkus has been working on what weak adjectives might have meant in Proto-Germanic. He's especially looking into Gothic, which of course is attested earlier than the other languages and in which the system is probably somewhat different. He publishes in English, and you should certainly look for Ratkus articles. They're really interesting. But this dual inflection of adjectives, yeah, it shows up in Balto-Slavic too. That's interesting.
Mhm.
But in Germanic, the weak adjectives have an N in the ending. They're N stems. In Balto-Slavic, what has happened is that what looks like a determiner beginning with ya has simply been tacked onto the adjective. So they're doing approximately the same thing. You know, the modern Lithuanian system might in function be sort of like the Proto-Germanic system, but they did it independently. So a double inflection of adjectives with weak adjectives that are end stems is distinctively Germanic.
Mhm.
And again, um, take a look at a chunk of prose with its translation. Um, you have to have enough adjectives in it, but you'll be able to see whether you're looking at a Germanic language or not fairly shortly by looking at how the adjectives are inflected. The English, of course, has scrapped it, but that's unusual for a Germanic language.
Yeah. One of the things that you said earlier that I want to real quick touch on is the idea of branching off. Um, I struggle to picture how we can have something like Proto-Slavic, Proto-Balto-Slavic and Proto-Germanic existing and then sort of going separate ways. Should we understand that as a sort of geographical phenomenon? Like people get separated and then when they get separated, they start speaking differently? Because it doesn't really seem like there is much separation across the forests of like Eastern Germany and Poland.
Oh,
That would like
there
am
isn't.
I misunderstanding that?
No, you're right. There isn't much separation now. But remember, we're talking about people doing slash and burn agriculture in the northern forest.
Oh, right.
Okay. Look at how it works in the Amazon. Each tribe, or I guess we might as well call them tribes, um, tries to keep as much empty territory around itself as possible because every 2 or 3 years their fields are exhausted and they have to move to a new location, right, and cut down or girdle the trees and establish new fields. They can't be running into groups who are competing with them for that. So they're always at war. And they're always trying to keep one another at as much distance as possible, right? And under those conditions, yeah, they're going to lose touch. And even within recent centuries, you've got the Northern Kayapa and the Southern Kayapa drifting apart, and their languages become somewhat different. Um, I don't know whether they're still dialects of a single language. Um, the same thing must have happened in the northern forests. And if you ask why were they trying to do such a damned thing in the northern forests, the answer has got to be they were driven into them by somebody who was more powerful. Probably the Proto-Indo-Iranians who seem to have wound up in possession of the Ukraine, the area from which most of the groups seem to have started. Um, if you've learned out, if you've learned how to make a living by farming in riverine forests in the steppe, you don't just pull up stakes and move into a dense forest. You have to be driven there. Okay. And again, there are known examples in history. Many of the nations that made a living with horses on the plains in the 18th and 19th centuries in what's now the United States, they started out as riverine farmers on the Saskatchewan and Red Rivers and the headwaters of the Mississippi and so forth. Um, but when the Ojibwe got guns from the French, they attacked those tribes and drove them out onto the plains to starve, just in time for them to run into and domesticate horses, fortunately,
Hmm.
right? Um, but they didn't do that because it seemed like a great idea. They did that because they were forced to. So
Right.
probably the same thing in Northern and Northeastern Europe. Um, and yeah, because they would have had to move around a lot and cut ties to make a living, they were going to lose touch with one another.
Mm. That's a great point. And I was actually just reading Caesar's De Bello Gallico, in which he was describing the German tribes and saying that they pride themselves in how far their neighbors are from each other, and that
That's
they
right.
take that as like a huge sign of their own virtus and like their power,
Yeah.
that their neighbors have distanced themselves greatly. I never thought that that would be a connection to their actual language change.
If he's right, but in some sense, he must be right. He probably didn't witness that himself. He didn't go very far into Germany. He was no fool. But he must have got his information from somewhere. Now, it might have been out of date. There seems to be archaeological evidence that at least not long after Caesar's time, there were beginning to be settled villages in the Rhineland and along the
Mm,
North Sea coast. Um, Probably partly because of contact with what was becoming the Roman Empire, um, but probably at an earlier date, at least what he was saying was true. Same deal with Tacitus. A lot of his information is certainly out of date, but it
mm.
was true at some point or other. The only question is when.
Yeah. Wonderful. So then we get into the sort of world of the Germanic families. And I think the next question I have is, as we progress down the road towards English,
Yeah.
the next distinction seems to be Anglo-Frisian, perhaps, is a good way to put it. Does that begin to distinguish itself in the same way that Proto-Germanic distinguished itself from other languages, or is it kind of like they went to England and that's why it's different?
They started being minimally different before they got to England. That's
Mhm.
completely clear. Um, I wrote an article about this that appeared in, I think, Northwestern European Language Evolution, Volume 66. That was in 2013, called What is Old English? Um, it was messier because by that point, let's say by the third century of the Common Era, um, people were living in settled villages, probably all over the West Germanic area. And so you get something more like what you've got um, in the development of Latin into Romance dialects, where changes begin maybe in population centers, except there might not have been any large population centers in northwestern Germany or Denmark, um, in villages maybe, and they spread. Um, Whether Anglo-Frisian is a useful concept is a matter of hot debate among specialists. The colleague who knows most about Germanic is Patrick Stiles, lives in London, is retired. Um, and Stiles is not convinced that Anglo-Frisian is a useful concept. What you do have is a bunch of dialects in Jutland and northern Germany and down into northwestern Germany, um, which share innovations in overlapping patterns. And you find that most of the time, the dialects which were going to become dialects of English share distinctive changes. But sometimes they share distinctive changes with Frisian, and sometimes with Old Saxon, and sometimes with both. There's a chart of like 16 changes early in that article with indications of what's shared. Um, and one of the striking things is that there is one change which differentiates the dialects that are going to become Old English. That is, does inherited West Germanic long A become E, as in West Saxon, and
Mhm.
probably East Saxon too, or does it become A, as in Kentish, that is Jutish, or the Anglian dialects? If you look at the distribution on a map of England, it makes no sense. If you look at the probable distribution on the map of Denmark and Germany, it makes sense.
Mhm.
So this is probably an incipient dialect difference on the continent between dialects which are going to become dialects of Old English. Now, of course, they were still mutually intelligible at that point. They shared most of the changes, but they were also mutually intelligible with the dialects that were going to become Old Frisian, which are also split along the same a parameter into East and West Frisian,
Right.
and were probably mutually intelligible with the dialects that were going to become Old Saxon, which share a couple of really important innovations in verb inflection with Frisian and English. So Anglo-Frisian as a useful concept, I kind of doubt it. Um, North Sea Germanic,
Mm.
yeah, okay, that makes a certain amount of sense. Um, I guess the name matters because it doesn't encourage you to think of English and Frisian as being necessarily special from the other Northern West Germanic dialects. Um, but it's clear that this was a bunch of dialects, mutually intelligible and sharing innovations in overlapping patterns. And the southern ones, the Old Saxon dialects, were also sharing innovations with the northern dialects that would become, Frankish and Old High German. It was dialect salad all the way down. And you can show that some of these dialect differences probably preceded changes that spread all the way through West Germanic. So there was never a unified West Germanic.
Mhm.
It was a dialect continuum to start with, right? And um, you can easily place the Old English dialects in it, um, but they were not special and they weren't entirely uniform either. Now, what happens when they get to England? There were a couple of early changes that they all share, so we can't tell whether they began on the continent or began after they got to England. So, hey, actually, when did they get to England? Well, it's clear that there were mercenaries, Saxon mercenaries, settled on the Saxon shore in the second half of the fourth century, when the Roman government was still in full control. And according to the traditions, which are not entirely reliable, but there's probably something behind them, it was only after the Roman government pulled out in 408 and 410 that you begin to get more immigration of Anglo-Saxons. It was never an invasion, it was immigration. And again, according to the traditions, some of them were actually invited by the local British warlords to help defend the country.
Right.
Um, in any case, by around the middle of the 5th century, by about 450 or so, you've got substantial Anglo-Saxon settlements up and down the eastern edge of the country, and probably in the Isle of Wight, and on the Middle Thames, up the Thames as far as, oh, let's say Oxford or something like that. Um, and it actually appears archaeologically that the West Saxons began on the Middle Thames. All these origin legends about them landing on the Isle of Wight or at Portsmouth or whatever. No, that's guesswork by later generations. So anyway, by the time you've got a critical mass of Anglo-Saxons, let's say 450, a long chain of changes begins that we can put in chronological order. This is the second chart in the article. Um, and they don't affect all the dialects identically. And this time, the geography makes sense only on a map of Britain, not on the continent.
Hmm.
Okay. So we have dialects which were almost identical to begin with, but not quite, being carried to Britain. And then we get them sharing innovations, and the innovations are spreading from one dialect to another, but they're not spreading through the entire population. That goes on until, I don't know, maybe the late 6th century, and then a change that really changes the grammar, I umlaut, sweeps through the entire island and affects all the dialects. And there's a bunch of changes after that, all of which affect all the dialects. And then finally, around the year 700 or so, they begin to diverge again.
Hmm.
Now, what the heck is going on? This must reflect something about the population, right? The early divergence could mean that the dialects were still separated by British settlements. That would be reasonable archaeologically and demographically. Oh, and by the way, when we say British, we really mean post-Roman,
Hmm.
because there are lots of Latin loanwords in Old English and very few British Celtic loanwords. And
Hmm.
people are reluctant to say, well, the lowland population must have been speaking Latin. Well, why not? I mean, they'd been part of the Roman Empire for 350 years. Okay. That's longer than Philadelphia has been in existence. Okay. Why the hell shouldn't they have been speaking Latin? That would account for the pattern. Anyway, um, maybe the early dialects were not in such close contact, but there did come a point in which they were. Around the time when the conversion began, when the missionaries came from Canterbury in 597,
Right.
we we begin having all sorts of news um, about kings marrying other kings' daughters and battles occurring all over the place. And this king or that king trying to become the Bretwalda, the titular overlord of all of Britain, right?
Hmm.
And that goes on at least into the 8th century when Bede is writing. So, yeah, maybe there is a period of isolation followed by a period of lots of contact. And then that would be followed by a period when the Anglo-Saxon population on the ground as peasants was so thick that innovations would stop spreading across the entire island. They would spread for
Hmm.
a while and then peter out. Now, I'm telling a story, okay? I can't prove any of this. Um, but it does make sense. And there must be some kind of story like that that lies behind this curious pattern of unshared and shared and unshared innovations. So,
Hmm.
is there such a thing of Old English? Yes, sure there is. Um, but there was never a unitary Old English, just as there was never a unitary West Germanic.
Hmm. When Bede tells us things like the Kentish are from Jutland and the we have the Anglian dialects supposedly from the Angles, and the West Saxons and the East Saxons from the Saxons. Can the linguistics reinforce that at all, or do we just kind of have to, I don't know, is there any sort of like aid that these two sources can provide to each other?
The linguistics is consistent with what Bede says.
Hmm.
Okay, there's not a lot of it. The development of long ah is like Exhibit A. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, the linguistics is consistent with what Bede says. Um, that's the best we can do. Now, it seems to be true um, that Jutish was something special. There are ways in which Kentish does not resemble the Saxon dialects that surround it.
Mhm.
Um, and it's certainly true that the Anglian dialects influenced one another and shared innovations and went a different way from the Saxon dialects. A lot of that could have happened in Britain, you
Mhm.
know. Um, Bede is probably oversimplifying. Archaeology suggests that there might have been Frisians and Franks in the mercenaries that settled in England. What is clear is that in each of the areas, the Kentish area, maybe the Isle of Wight, which is also supposed to have been settled by Jutes, though we have hardly any linguistic evidence from it. Anyway, the Kentish area and the Saxon area and the Anglian area, they certainly did develop more or less coherent uh, um, dialect groups.
Mhm. One thing that I'm very interested to ask you about, and one of the reasons why I use your work so much is because I speak Old English, and I'm many people that I know speak Old English to one another. And whenever you speak a language that's dead, obviously the question of pronunciation comes up. Um, how confident do you think we should or could be in our current understanding of, let's say, early West Saxon, maybe late ninth century pronunciation?
I think we can be pretty confident. If you take a look at the older standard grammars, Campbell 1965, Brunner 1965, um, and at the exhaustive collection of early West Saxon forms in Cosine's grammar from the 1880s, um, there's a lot of information in there about what was going on in early West Saxon. Now, the less material we've got, the less confident we can be about the details. So we're fairly certain that initial sk had become sh in early West Saxon because
Mhm.
they spell Scholde sometimes Sceolde, and sometimes they leave out the first E, which shows that we're not dealing with a diphthong. Um, you can quibble about particular details. Thenchan clearly had a ch in it. Sometimes you can look ahead to early Middle English, 12th century, early 13th century Middle English, when they started using French spelling conventions, which were different. And by
Yeah.
comparing the two, you can figure out what was going on. Um, Carl Lewick's massive historical grammar of English. 1,000 pages, and he only got through the phonology down to the 15th century. I'm good Lord. Um, there's quite a lot of very detailed information about what the evidence is for
Mhm.
any particular time. I think that's all highly reliable. There are going to be details that we can't figure out.
One thing that I notice separates you from some other scholars is the palatalization of the ng sound at the end of words like either thing or thinge or like ring and ringe. Do you have opinions on that, or I'm not sure if there's been much conversation about that?
There hasn't been much conversation about that, but so far as I can tell, and especially from early Middle English spellings, ng and unk at the end of words apparently did not palatalize, which is
Mhm.
curious, right? So thing or ink to the two of you. Hmm. Um, I looked into it. I went looking for spellings with ch in early Middle English. Can't find any. As far as I can tell, it's always thing and König or king, right? It's always rink, warrior. You never find a spelling with a ch. Um, but that is the kind of detail about which it's reasonable to disagree.
Right.
Now, be aware that if you look at Campbell's grammar, unlike most other sources, Campbell does not put a dot over a C, which definitely became a ch. He puts a dot over any C that was ever palatalized at all, even if the palatalization did not get as far as the ch stage. This
Interesting.
is awkward and confusing. It took me a while to figure this out. Okay, so you would do better actually to consult as many sources as possible and try to make up your mind. Um,
Mhm.
if you don't mind reading early Middle English, I mean it's mostly sermons, but if you don't mind reading them, it's that can be helpful. And of course, Lewick is also always a tremendous source for early English pronunciation.
Mhm. Yeah, I was actually just talking to Mark Faulkner a couple weeks ago about he's actually going to come out with an anthology of 12th century literature sometime soon, which
Excellent.
will be pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the sort of difficulties of pronunciation when we get from the 11th to the 12th century. Uh, what do you think about the theory that we shouldn't trust late West Saxon orthography? That like when Alfrich writes his homilies, he's not necessarily writing how he actually pronounced it, and that by then it had kind of been a almost obsolete orthography in the same sense that like modern English kind of has like a quirky sort of obsolete in some areas orthography.
I'm afraid that that hypothesis is correct. Yeah, not as obsolete as modern English orthography and not as fixed either, as you know. Um,
Mhm,
but yeah, it seems fairly clear that on the whole, the scribal tradition of writing the West Saxon chancery language, as it's called, did not keep up with pronunciation, probably even in the Southwest. It was only ever the Southwestern dialect, although it absorbed stuff from other dialects as it went along.
mhm,
Um, and yeah, you need to remember that this is a society in which almost nobody but the clergy and maybe the high nobility can read and write. You know, okay, maybe a few merchants in London, but Scandinavians seem to have dominated the merchant class in London around the year
mhm,
1000. So that's a different situation. Um, yeah, what looks like stasis between about 950 and 1100 is probably nothing of the kind. It's probably a conservative spelling tradition.
mhm,
Um, on the other hand, um, if you take a look at the continuations of the Peterborough Chronicle, um, those and the earlier interpolations do provide some telltale clues to what was going on in probably the local dialect. Unfortunately, it wasn't West Saxon, right? It was some Anglian dialect spoken in what, Huntingdonshire or Northamptonshire, wherever Peterborough is. Um, but yeah, that you can actually probably trust. Unfortunately, the last continuation, which is the most reliable because they've given up even trying to write the Chancery language,
mhm. Right.
that's like 6 pages long. You just have to mine out of it whatever you can. You can trust the Ormulum. I mean, reading the Ormulum will put you to sleep, but Brother Orm really cared about how his verse sermons were pronounced, and he made great efforts to indicate how they should be pronounced. So
Mhm.
he's a good witness to to Middle English in southern Lincolnshire in the decades before 1200. Um, Laramon's Brute, if only we had an autograph copy, would be an equally good witness to what was going on in the Severn Valley at the same time. Unfortunately, the copies are generations later.
Yeah.
However, the Ancrana and the Catherine group, although it now appears that they were written sometime between, let's say, 1200 and 1220, also in the Severn Valley, where exactly isn't clear. Um, Although we don't have an autograph manuscript of any of those, um, it looks like they were all copied by scribes who spoke the same dialect as the author or authors. So this is almost as good as autograph. And in Dardennes, Theliflada Antepassion of Sainte Juliana, right? Um, Dardenne has a long essay on what's called the AB language, basically that particular language, that particular dialect. Um, and it seems clear that the spelling of the Ancarnariola and the Catherine group is also a trustworthy indication of what the dialect was like. Um, you have to be careful. That dialect was in the area in which word initial anterior fricatives were voiced, but they still keep writing the Fs. Every once in a while, they'll forget and write a U for a V, and that
Uh-huh.
tips you off to what's going on. But by and large, yeah, those late 12th century documents are pretty good in terms of spelling things the way they pronounce them.
And so, am I to understand that means like a word like verse would be pronounced like verse and not like vers, which is, I think, one of the earlier Old English loans from that word?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
makes sense.
exactly. Right. Um, and all the native words too. I mean, a few of them survive in modern English. You know, we say fox, but vixen.
Yeah,
Vixen is a southern form, south of the Thames, sometime in the 12th century, or maybe the
fascinating.
11th. Yeah. Or similarly, vane, as in weather vane, and vat for
Huh.
Old English fat container. Those are the ones that I can find. Those are the ones that everybody cites. Um,
Yeah, makes sense. Wonderful. So you have mentioned a lot of recent scholarship throughout this interview so far. How, in your time teaching over the past couple decades, how has our knowledge of this sort of Indo-European Germanic philology improved?
in philological terms, knowledge of comparative Germanic and Proto-Germanic has sort of been proceeding detail by detail. You know, um,
Mhm.
there hasn't been any major overturn of what anyone has thought since about 1960, when I was 6 years old, right? Um, the number of scholars who have contributed is considerable. There are way too many to mention. Um, but important articles and books by Robert Fulk and Frank Heidemanns and Eugen Hill and Ron Kim and Patrick Stiles, and by some Indo-Europeanists, especially Jay Jasanoff, who's basically the leading Indo-Europeanist in North America. They've all pushed forward our understanding of comparative Germanic in significant ways without, as I say, uh, overturning much of the old work. Um, Another thing, though, that has happened is that new methods have been brought to bear. Um, Pre-Chomskyan syntax is completely inadequate. Um, it's oriented wrong. It builds on the classical tradition that regards syntax as the interface between morphology and meaning. But you can prove from the syntax of, say, modern German or modern English that syntax is an autonomous system. It's not the interface with anything. And it's a communication system which can be studied internally, essentially by mathematical means.
Mhm.
That's what Chomsky basically established. So modern work on Germanic syntax has pushed things forward remarkably. I guess the earliest work, which is still really, really useful, is Cynthia Allen's work on Old and Middle English. She was, I think, the first modern syntactician who also acquired a really good knowledge of Old English and came to some conclusions which have stood the test of time. Everything she's published is worth reading. Um,
Mhm.
Possibly the most spectacular book is Genitives in Early English, in which she manages to prove, and I do mean prove, that the apostrophe S clitic of modern English is actually the genitive singular ending of default masculine and neuter nouns in Old English. She not only established that, she also established importantly that morphology is not a one-way street. It's not the case that syntax becomes morphology and it's like being swallowed by a black hole and it never comes out again. Morphology can become syntax. It all depends on what the pattern the native learner is presented with. Um, More recently, Ans van Kemenade and Bettelou Loss and George Walkden have published a good deal on Germanic syntax in general and English syntax in particular. Walkden's book of 2014, Syntactic Reconstruction and Proto-Germanic, is well worth the read. What's especially fascinating is his section on why comparative reconstruction of syntax is so darn hard. Uh, Everyone should certainly read that. Um, However, to do comparative syntax, you need good training in syntax. Okay, um,
Mhm.
I'm young enough that I did get some training in generative syntax in grad school, but that was the late 1970s. That was before the overhaul of syntax that led to government and binding theory in the 1980s, and then minimalism in the early 1990s. And because I have had colleagues in syntax to whom I was close, I managed to kind of catch up with government and binding theory, but I haven't caught up with minimalism. And I've never done any work on syntax. You really need training in syntax to do work on syntax. However, that is a wide open avenue for further progress in the study of Germanic and of English specifically. Then there's computational cladistics, which I've done some work in. Basically, I've been the linguistic consultant to a bunch of first-rate computer scientists. But I have learned some things about how they work. Um, if you want to pursue that, you need to find a computer scientist who's interested and work with the computer scientist, unless, again, you yourself have training in computer science. Um, then there's the new approach to language learning, the mathematical analysis of language learning that Charles Yang of our department has pioneered. Um, he's come up with something called the tolerance principle. His recent book, The Price of Productivity,
Mhm.
is about how native language errors result in grammatical rules becoming more productive. He and I published an article on how stringed became strung and digged became dug. in
Uh,
the 16th and 17th centuries. That appeared in a conference volume from the Edinburgh Conference in 2018. Um, and his students, Jordan Codner um, and Caitlin Richter, pursued dissertations using the tolerance principle to find out, in Richter's case, um, how some recent and some earlier changes in various languages could have occurred. In Codner's case, how you can use the tolerance principle even to investigate changes in prehistory.
mhm,
What he had to show is that the vocabularies reconstructed for proto languages share a large overlap with the vocabularies of child directed speech. And it's plausible because it's mostly basic words that can be reconstructed,
mhm,
right? But he managed to show statistically that it's true. And the result is that Yang's approach can now be used to investigate all sorts of, especially morphological changes, changes in inflection. And there's some really interesting examples in Codner's thesis, um, including how you get the long E in the default past tense of class 4 and class 5 strong verbs.
hmm. Fascinating. The last question I had then is that if someone wants to become a historical linguist, what do you think they need to know? Like, what areas do you think they need to develop a proficiency in?
Well, regardless of which avenue you go, learn the languages you work on. Learn them well enough not to make blunders when using the data. Okay. Yeah, I mean that's really what it comes to. You, you you don't need to be able to read them off the page. I mean, I can't read Umbrian off the page, although I think Michael Weiss can. Um, but yeah, you need to learn them well enough to get the data right. Um, What else you need to learn depends on what you want to do. If you want to pursue old-fashioned philology, that might be all you need to do. When you've learned, you know this obviously, when you've learned 3 or 4 languages, each next one becomes easier and easier, and you can just keep working your way into languages by yourself, right? Um, Similarly, if you've been trained as an Indo-Europeanist or even as a comparative Germanic scholar, you know how to handle the secondary literature. You can work your way into the secondary literature as necessary. The problem is that most of the really big questions that comparative philology, old-fashioned philology, can solve have already been solved. And if you want to do something bigger in the field, you need to pursue syntax or computational cladistics, um, or the almost certainly true hypothesis that native language acquisition is the source of most grammar changes and mathematical ways to approach that, because you need the math to extrapolate into prehistory. Um, and there may be other, oh, well, there's corpus linguistics. I forgot to mention that. Um, I've been in touch with corpus linguists for most of my career. I've never done any actual work in it myself. Um, but corpus linguistics, using syntactically parsed corpora, um, is a new avenue for finding out new things about languages of the past. Um,
Hmm,
the English corpora are now pretty good. We have an exhaustive corpus of Old English, the Penn York Helsinki parsed corpus. There's also a Penn parsed corpus of Middle English, of early modern English, and of modern British English.
hmm,
There's a parsed corpus of early Middle English correspondence, focusing, for instance, on the Paston letters and the Seeley and Stoner letters.
hmm.
Um, they're all valuable. You have to learn how to use a syntactic search engine, unless you're just working on inflectional morphology. But again, um, That's one way forward. And, if someone thinking about going into the field, I think it would be advisable to learn one of these parallel avenues or approaches as well as the languages, because
Mhm.
not only will it make it far more likely that you'll come up with something really big and new and interesting, it will also make you far more employable. I mean, really, and you know, I don't have any graduate advisees at the moment, but I did have a few fairly recently.
Mhm.
Employability is a serious problem. It's becoming worse and worse. It's been a problem for some time. You need to think about it.
Well, there's always the YouTube channel route.
So long as you can support yourself with a day job, right?
Yeah. Oh,
Be like T.S. Eliot, who was a bank clerk.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, there is
I mean, yeah.
precedent here.
For that matter, Patrick Stiles spent a lot of his working life writing for the London Times.
Huh. I
And
didn't know that.
he's still managed to produce, I think, more first quality work on comparative Germanic than anyone else I can readily think of. It can be done.
Hmm. That reminds me, one of the top scholars on Tolkien's languages actually is a NASA computer scientist.
There you go.
He doesn't have anything to do. It's yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah,
Carl Hostetter is his name, if you ever read his stuff.
can be
Anyway,
done.
well, thanks so much for this, Don Ringe. Thanks for coming on the channel.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much. Have a good one.